get the questions box open here. And okay, welcome everybody to the first session, synchronous statewide session for Sociology 111 online sections. This is something that we'll be doing on a weekly basis. I'll also be recording these so that if people can't attend, they will be able to view them later, and the link will be sent out from central office for that. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 1 of the Sociology textbook by Richard Schaefer. I've got the PowerPoint loaded here, and that's what we're going to be doing during this first session. All right, I need to leave that open. Okay. Okay, so when we think about sociology, one of the first things we need to do, of course, is what are we talking about? What is sociology? These are some of the questions we're going to be addressing in this first chapter. What is sociological theory? We'll be taking a look at the history of sociology and the development of sociology. We will examine the major theoretical perspectives of sociology. We'll try to talk about ways that you can actually take sociology with you. As I always tell my students, and I tell students that's in every class, I don't expect everybody in this class to all of a sudden be bitten by the sociology bug and think, oh, I'm ready to become a sociologist now, that's what I want to pursue and that's what I want to do. But I hope that you take something of value from this, and that sociology helps you to navigate through the social world. Some of the stuff you learn in this class can have value in work, in social relationships, things like that. However, should you be interested in sociology, we'll also talk a little bit towards the end of the chapter about what you could do as far as a career in sociology. So, taking a little bit of a look ahead here, what we're going to be talking about, how did sociology develop? What were the foundations? Where did it originate? In what ways does it differ from the other social sciences, including things like psychology, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, but other ones include history, political science, philosophy, economics. Does it relate to the other social sciences? Who are the pioneers? And how does sociology help us develop what C. Wright Mills refers to as the sociological imagination? And what Mills, of course, was talking about was the ability to see how the historical and current social forces of a particular society shape the individual experiences people have living within that society. And then understanding that, of course, helps us to get outside of our own kind of culture and employ what Peter Berger called the sociological perspective, which is being able to get beyond our own culture and just understand the actual behaviors that are happening. So, definition of sociology: the scientific study of social behavior in human groups. Essentially, sociology is the science that studies what people do during interaction on all different levels, on all different scales. So, some of the things that might be focused on, of course, how relationships influence people's attitudes and behaviors, how societies develop and change. One, if we think about it, could be thought of as sort of what you might call the micro level of sociology. How do individuals' attitudes and behaviors get shaped through interaction? And the other might be thought of as kind of a macro level sociological approach. How societies develop and change, where you're looking at all of a society and focusing on the big picture. The other one, very, very minor, micro level, focusing deep on the individual. So, I mentioned C. Wright Mills, the sociological imagination. So, an awareness of the relationship between an individual and the wider society. That's one way we can think about this. But what does that mean? Well, if we think about like how an individual is both responsible for contributing to society, but at the same time also constrained and shaped by society. I mentioned Peter Berger. Peter Berger and the sociological perspective. A key element of the sociological imagination is the sociological perspective, because this is that ability to make the familiar strange, to view one society as an outsider would, so that you're focusing on the behaviors. And as an example of that, let me just ask a question here. I'm going to do it in sort of a rhetorical fashion. If you'd like to type in an answer there, feel free to. What, from just a purely behavioral, if we're thinking about just what the behavior is, from a behavioral standpoint, what is the difference between sitting down to a meal of cooked beef versus a meal of cooked dog? That little shudder that may run up your spine when I say cooked dog is your culture talking to you. It's what you consider kind of right and normal and proper, which is what sociologists refer to as an attitude, ethnocentrism. So when we think about that, but if we think about what the actual behavior is, when we sit down and we eat a meal of cooked beef or we eat a meal of cooked dog meat, the behavior is exactly the same. It is the consumption of the flesh of another animal for sustenance of life. So we have to get beyond the idea that cows are food, dogs are pets, and part of the family. That's our culture. So we have to be able to view our society as an outsider to understand that essentially both behaviors, eating cow, eating dog, are the same. It's the consumption of flesh. The difference comes from our culture. So it looks beyond the limited understanding of human behavior, what we might call common sense, right? Which, when you actually investigate it, is neither very common nor does it make sense sometimes. But sociology actually researches and looks into stuff. So we view the world and its people in a new way, see it through a broader lens, and we employ the scientific method. Auguste Comte, who created the word sociology, coined that actual word, took social and ology as the social world and the study of, and put them together to create the term sociology, wanted it practiced in a scientific fashion. He modeled it after the natural sciences and said that actually in the hierarchical order of sciences, the study of the social world came at the top because it was an attempt to explain the actions of human beings who are at the pinnacle of creation, as it were. So when Auguste Comte founded it, it was positivist sociology that he was all about, or empiricist sociology. He wanted sociology practiced as a science using the scientific method of hypothesis formulation and testing, employing concepts of validity and reliability. So it is practiced as a science. Max Weber, another early sociologist who was towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, German sociologist, said that sociology should be practiced value neutral, value free. We do not make value judgments when we are conducting sociology. So it's based on the natural sciences, the models of the scientific method from the natural sciences. You think about physics, biology. They have laws, scientific laws. That's what Auguste Comte was looking for, were those laws that govern human interaction in the same way that Newton's laws of motion, laws of gravity, laws of energy conservation govern sort of the way that motion and energy occurs in the natural world. So the natural science is the study of physical features of nature and the ways they interact and change, but sociology is what we refer to as the social science. Study of social features of humans and the way they interact and change. And there are a number of different social sciences, as we mentioned just a little bit ago. Psychology, political science, economics, history, and they all study various facets of human activity. So, sociology, as a study, studies the influence society has on people's attitudes and behaviors. When we think about choices we make, one of the things we like to say in the United States of America is that we have freedom, and the freedom that we like to celebrate and talk about is the freedom of choice. We're free to choose our own individual actions. We can choose to be whatever we want, choose to do whatever we want. But is that really 100% true? Can we choose to be or do anything we want in our society, or are there constraints? Well, first of all, of course, certain actions there are laws prohibiting. So we are constrained somewhat by society. But beyond just those particular constraints, think about it in another way. The only choices we can make for social actions are the choices that our society offers to us or deems appropriate for us to select from. So when we talk about being constrained by society, it's not some sort of physical constraint that actually restricts the choices you make, except in the sense that it restricts the realm of possibilities you have to choose from for your choices. Another thing, it seeks to understand ways in which people interact and shape society. The idea of the social construction of reality, that what we kind of together do on a social basis is collectively shape what our social reality is. Mentioned that we practice this scientifically, right? So we're examining social relationships scientifically. Some of the things, if you think about it, sociology, broadly speaking, studies anything people do. But there are researchers right now looking into natural disasters, like how people react to natural disasters like the Haiti earthquake, how people react in social disasters, I guess, for lack of a better term, such as the Virginia Tech shootings, and again, by another natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina. It's interesting that President Obama actually kind of had made mention during certain aspects of his campaign and during his presidency that he has specifically requested to have sociologists on his advisory board, and does have a sociologist on his advisory board. Sociologists, because they do social research, are sometimes sought to advise government agencies on responding to disasters, or more broadly, just on social policy in general. Mentioned this a little bit earlier, right? Common sense. Sociologists do not accept something as a fact because everybody knows it. Okay? 300 years ago, everybody knew that storks brought babies. We can't just accept things that people say are common sense. Each piece of information must be tested, recorded, analyzed. It's the scientific method. We gather data, we interpret the data, and allow the data to support or disprove our hypotheses. Okay, some things that there might be some common assumptions about. Women tend to be chatty. Military marriages are more likely to end in separation or divorce. These may be true, but we can't just accept that they are true. If we're going to make a statement like that, the first thing we're going to have to do is do empirical research, gathering data. We'll have to figure out some way to operationalize variables and concepts in the statement or the hypothesis that women tend to be chatty. So we have to figure out what our variables are, and then we have to kind of figure out a way to measure those variables, which is the process called operationalization. We'll be talking more about that when we talk about methods in the next chapter. The next one, military marriage is more likely to end in separation or divorce. Again, we would need to analyze that. We would need to investigate whether or not that's true. And usually where that begins, you begin from kind of a broad theory. A theory is a set of statements that seeks to explain problems, actions, or behaviors. A theory is essentially, you can kind of think of it about, it's a set of sentences designed to offer an explanation of some phenomena in either the social world for the social sciences or the natural world for the natural sciences. So when we develop theory, what we're trying to do is we're trying to offer explanations for the phenomena we observe. In order for a theory to be considered an effective theory, it has to offer explanatory power. When we think about the field of physics, physics is constantly searching for what they call the grand unified theory. Because right now, physics has kind of divided theories. They have Einstein's theory of general relativity, which has great explanatory power with regards to sort of large objects, if you can think about it that way. When we talk about gravity and acceleration, relativity explains an object falling towards a planet very well. It explains certain things about time dilation as well. But relativity does not explain atomic and subatomic particle behavior really kind of at all. And so that's where quantum mechanics comes in. And quantum mechanics has great explanatory power for the very, very small, for the subatomic particles, for the atoms and the way that they act, and then the particles making up the atoms. So right now, physics has two theories. One offers great explanatory power on kind of a large scale. One offers great explanatory power on kind of a small scale, but there's nothing unifying them. They cannot offer explanatory power in the other side, on the small or the large. So physics continues to search for the theory. That's where the idea of string theory or loop quantum gravity theory come in. These are attempts to unify quantum mechanics with general relativity. And then you would have a theory that would have great explanatory power. Part of the problem there, though, just as an aside, string theory requires 12 dimensions in order for its mathematical equations to work for both small and large. And I don't know that much about quantum loop gravity. We have three big theories that offer explanatory power in sociology as it's practiced here in the United States of America: structural functionalism, social conflict, and symbolic interaction. And each of these have explanatory and somewhat predictive power as well. When we talk about predictive power, going back to the idea of relativity, predicting, or just general physics, predicting how long you can actually calculate how long it will take an object to fall from a given height on Earth. And that's because you know what the acceleration of gravity is. That gives you that predictive power. When we talk about the difference between the natural sciences and the social sciences, when you drop an object at sea level on Earth in a vacuum, any object, it accelerates towards the center of the planet at 32 feet per second per second. The problem with social sciences is they don't have the predictive power that's as strong as in the natural sciences, because people are aware and self-aware, and people make choices. So the predictive power is much less in the social sciences. We can offer predictions about general trends, but not down to the level of what an individual will do in a given situation. This is an interesting study when we talk about Durkheim's study of suicide. Durkheim took what he kind of framed as one of the most individualistic acts a person can make and showed that there was a social component to it. His book Suicide is essentially showing that when we make choices, what we do in society, the ways that we act in society, is shaped and constrained by that social group aware entity around us. So when Durkheim studied suicide, what he found was that there is a group component to the act of what he referred to as anomic suicide. And there were 4 different types of suicide: egoistic suicide, fatalistic suicide, anomic suicide, and altruistic suicide. Durkheim focused most of his work in the book Suicide on anomic suicide. So where did sociology begin? People have been observing and recording human behavior for thousands of years. Philosophers, religious authorities made observations of human behavior in ancient and medieval societies, as it says there. But even beyond that, poets made observations about human behavior. Historians made observations about human behavior. These are some of the social sciences, or some of the sciences and arts that extend back to the beginnings of human history. But it kind of wasn't until you think about the philosophical enlightenment beginning 17th, 18th century, roughly in Europe. During that period, you had people like Thomas Paine writing books like The Rights of Man. You had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, writing about the social contract. Going back into the 16th century, Hobbes writing Leviathan. These were some attempts to start to begin to understand behavior from kind of an individual, or the average person standpoint. Prior to that, the focus in philosophy, the focus in history was to focus on sort of extraordinary individuals and how extraordinary individuals live their lives, and how could a person live an extraordinary life, and instead of focusing more on what was out there. And then along came Auguste Comte, began publishing towards the beginning of the 19th century. And Comte, in his social physics and social statics, which were the ideas he had on how we were going to discover the laws governing human society. We would have laws governing interaction, the social physics, and laws governing social structure, the social statics. And Comte's idea was, of course, that we were doing this with an eye towards making improvements in society, so that we could suggest policy changes. Coined the term sociology, as I mentioned. The other thing that we remember Comte for is he really kind of was the first person to say, you know what? It's not enough that we look at society and that we record what we see and we make observations about behavior. What we need to do is take the scientific method and apply that to the study of human society. Harriet Martineau, one of the early feminist figures, also an early sociologist, studied social behavior in Britain and the U.S. She actually made a widespread tour of the U.S., recording her observations, looking at the subordinate status of women and making comparisons of that to the institution of slavery as she saw it here in the U.S. She took a look at all these various areas: economy, law, trade, health, population, on social problems. very much an early feminist, falls into sort of the conflict theorist, whereas Comte would be more of a functionalist kind of approach, looking at how society functions. This is a little bit before we get the development of those theoretical paradigms, though. Herbert Spencer was most definitely a structural functionalist. Herbert Spencer is actually the person, believe it or not, who gave us a phrase widely attributed to Darwin. Herbert Spencer is the person who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And what he was talking about there was societies, though. He was talking about survival of the fittest in the social world. He believed that societies evolved. He was also one of the first persons to look at society and use the metaphor of an organism and evolution from the natural world to explain social behavior. Emil Durkheim, widely acknowledged as the founder of the structural functionalist approach in a number of works: The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Suicide, The Division of Labor in Society, Principles of Sociology. Durkheim published a wide number of books and was really looking at the way that society and the way that the group affected individual behaviors. Believed that behavior must be understood within a larger social context. And this idea of what he called the collective conscience, which was essentially a set of socially acceptable values, behaviors, and attitudes that were socialized into individuals so that individuals understood the proper way to act in society. Also came up with this idea, I mentioned anomic suicide. Anomy is a feeling of a loss of direction. And it's due to a lack of social cohesion and social regulation. Pardon me for a second. I needed to get a drink. My throat's getting a little scratchy there. Anomy is the loss of direction felt by individuals within a society when that society is failing to provide social cohesion, social regulation, kind of social control of individual behavior. We think about the Great Depression. You may have heard stockbrokers hurling themselves out the windows of the crash of 1929 on Wall Street. This would be a prime example, a perfect example of Durkheim's anomic suicide. When the economy's in a shambles, there's not anything regulating, controlling behaviors, keeping people from killing themselves, essentially. Durkheim felt that there had to be kind of regulation of individuals to a certain extent, but not an overabundance of it, lest they be pushed into altruistic suicide, similar to kamikaze pilots or the suicide bombers that are so prevalent in the region we refer to as the Middle East. Max Weber, I mentioned earlier, gave us the idea of sociology being practiced as a value-neutral with a value-neutral approach, that we need to practice it objectively and we need to practice it free of bias. Also believed that the natural focus level of sociology should be at the micro level, the level of individual interactions. Weber believed that even when you're talking about something as vast as, say, the United States of America, which encompasses a very large territory of land and 300 million people, you're really talking about individual interactions between all of those people. Came up with this idea of what he called his ideal type, specifically looking at an ideal type of bureaucracy, which has 6 characteristics. We'll, of course, be covering that in more detail in a later chapter when we get to the chapter on groups, organizations, work economy. We get into some of those ideas of the ideal type there when we're looking at the bureaucratic structure. But Weber said we can create these abstract constructs that we use for evaluating real-world examples. We have an abstract construct of a bureaucracy. We can compare and contrast bureaucratic structures we find in various social institutions within different societies, using that abstract construct as the basis for that comparison. Also had this idea of what he called Verstehen, V-E-R-S-T-E-H-E-N, which is a German word. A loose translation would be understanding, comprehension. And so what he said is, in order to understand behavior, we have to understand what people are trying to express with that behavior. We have to comprehend what they're trying to express. And so we can kind of think about Weber as his theoretical approach would be trying to look at expression through action. Everything that people do has a meaning that they're attaching to it, and we have to understand that meaning in order to understand the behavior itself. Insight might be another way of thinking about the word Verstehen. Karl Marx. I'm sure everybody's kind of heard of Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto is his most famous publication, but interestingly enough, that's a small pamphlet, probably his most influential publication with regards to social science. You might make an argument for Capital, although the Feuerbach theses and the Grundrisse, you can make arguments for those too, but Capital was his big 3-volume work on what he referred to as historical materialism, or what Adam Smith would call political economy. Marx's work Capital would have been similar in vein to Adam Smith's work in The Wealth of Nations, where he's analyzing the interplay of politics and economics, and looking at how the economy shapes the nature of the social world itself. For Marx, of course, the economy was the foundation of the society. And when I say the economy, what you're talking about there is you're talking about the means of production. And for Marx, the people who controlled the means of production were what he would have looked at as the haves, or he termed in an industrial society, the bourgeoisie, and then the workers, or the have-nots, the proletariats. And it's tension or conflict over access to resources between the haves and the have-nots that is the social kind of mechanism driving social change forward. And this would eventually lead to what Marx believed or had written in the Communist Manifesto, the rise of the proletariat. After they developed a class consciousness, the proletariat would rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and establish the truly classless society. Marx believed that the history of human activity was the history of competition and conflict over the means of production, over resources. He did a lot of work with Friedrich Engels, and Friedrich Engels was another early feminist. Engels actually looked at the suffrage movement when it was operating in England and was a supporter of it, was an advocate of female rights early on. And so a lot of what they're looking at is the class structure, class differentiation, although Marx really kind of saw society as two classes, the owners and the workers, whether you're talking about a feudal society where you had the aristocracy that were the owners of land, and then the serfs who were the workers, or an industrial society where what the French would have called the nouveau riche, Marx referred to as the bourgeoisie, or essentially think about the owners of the factories, the factory owners. And then the former serfs who moved in to become laborers, what Marx referred to as the proletariat. He believed that a class consciousness would develop amongst the proletariat, amongst the laborers. They would rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie. One of the reasons that Marx's works fell into disfavor was his predicted revolution never occurred. Neo-Marxists have actually addressed that somewhat, and they say that essentially there are some neo-Marxist researchers who believe that because of the standard of living that has been provided to the workers in societies like the United States of America, where the standard of living is fairly high, this is what alleviated the kind of impetus that would have eventually led to the Marxist revolution. Another early sociologist, a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was actually the first African-American PhD graduate from Harvard, was an early study of urban life and how urban life differed from rural life, was also an early advocate for equal rights on a racial basis between blacks and whites, co-founder of the Niagara movement, which eventually became the NAACP, and gave us this idea of what he called the talented tenth. He disputed Booker Washington's politics of accommodation and believed that that was the wrong way to go about achieving equality. He said we need to have educated African Americans, what he referred to as the talented tenth, who would then lead the rest of the African American racial group to equality. And so he believed that knowledge was essential in combating prejudice. Also gave us this idea of what he called the double consciousness, which is when members of minority groups view themselves not only through the lens of their own kind of personality and experiences, but also through the critical lens of the dominant cultural group. Du Bois was focusing on the reason that double consciousness developed, according to him, was that for African American males, they were denied expression in a way that was recognized as male by American culture, in which masculine was the provider, the protector, things like this. And African American males were prevented from being the provider and the protector during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War. In fact, protecting your family for an African American male could be dangerous and lead to loss of life in a lynching. So Du Bois believed that this led to the development of a double consciousness in African American males. So it's the division of individuals' identity into two or more social realities. Charles Horton Cooley was at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, but worked closely with the Chicago School, which is kind of the home of American sociology at the University of Chicago. So we're actually not too far from the seat of American sociology. Cooley developed this idea of what he called the looking glass self, which is a construct we will examine in more detail when we get to the chapter on socialization. But essentially, Cooley developed this idea that the self is a social construct. So he also developed this idea of what he called primary groups. Again, we'll discuss this in more detail when we get to the chapter on groups and organizations. But Cooley essentially looked at what is going on in a group and came up with this idea of primary groups, which were what he termed face-to-face groups. face-to-face groups with emotional bonds where the group itself is the focus of the group and there's not another reason drawing the group together. Those are what Cooley called primary groups. Jane Addams at the University of Chicago did a lot of important work in that she was one of the first what you would call applied sociologists. She took theory and applied it in the field. For this, and also probably because she was a woman, her work was actually devalued by all of her male colleagues at the University of Chicago. And she was referred to not as a sociologist, but as a social worker. But that's not to say that she didn't write social theory. And one of her great pieces, of course, of Men Were Seeking the Franchise is probably one of the best pieces of political satire I've read. But she was the founder of Hull House, and so you can see here she looked at the troubles that immigrants were facing trying to assimilate into life in Chicago, and she put her theory into practice in Hull House. The original purpose of Hull House was to facilitate immigrant entrance into social life in the Chicago metropolitan area. Robert Merton did a lot of work on deviance, trying to explain deviant behavior. Again, another one who applied he applied his theory he developed out of research. He used what we would call, as opposed to a deductive approach, which is where you develop a hypothesis, gather data, and test your hypothesis. Merton pioneered kind of looking at doing what we would call inductive work, which is where you start going out and gathering data, and then you develop a theory out of the data you gather. And it's not, I don't want to present it like it's one or the other, because it's actually more of kind of like a revolution pattern where you go from induction to deduction and from deduction to induction as you go through the research process. You're developing hypotheses, gathering data, testing the hypotheses, and then adjusting the hypotheses based upon the data you've gathered. So when you do research, it's constantly a deductive, inductive, circular pattern that you're going through. But anyway, Merton developed this kind of four-square explanation of deviant behavior that included conformists, innovators, ritualists, retreatists, and revolutionaries. When we get to the chapter on deviance, we will look at that in more detail. But it was also Merton who gave us this idea of macro and micro sociology, and Merton developed, building on kind of what Cooley had done with primary groups, developed the ideas about what secondary groups are, which are larger informal groups. Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist operating, doing a lot of his work in the second half of the 20th century, kind of came up with this idea that there's more than one type of capital you can use in a society to achieve your goals. Did a lot of his work on what was called cultural capital. There are three types of capital, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the chapters, successive chapters, but Bourdieu had this idea that there are more than one type of capital. You got social capital, and you can think about that as who you know. You've got economic capital, and that's money and assets and wealth and things like that. But you've also got cultural capital, which is knowledge, and that's what you know. Education is a form of cultural capital, but also having knowledge of the behaviors, values, and attitudes of the rich people in a particular society can be a form of cultural capital that you can use to exchange. Because If you understand the behaviors of those people, you're free to mingle with them, and then you can develop contacts, you develop social and economic capital through cultural capital. So we can think about this as a non-economic goods reflected in a knowledge of language and arts. And then social capital is this idea of all the social networks, the people you're connected to. And if you think about it this way, like social capital is capital you can use for exchange as well. Because if you're looking for a job, the best way to find a job is to talk to people and ask them to put out feelers for you. Talk to friends in your social network. 60% of the jobs that people get in our economy are gotten through social networks, not through OneAds or Monster.com or things like that. So more than just one type of capital, and Pierre Bourdieu in books like La Distinction and Language and Power kind of explored these ideas of how you can use knowledge to achieve your goals. Okay, now I've been mentioning theoretical perspectives. We've looked at some of the theorists, early and later theorists, some of the seminal theorists that kind of led to sociology being where it is as a field now. There are others. We didn't talk about Randall Collins. We didn't talk about some Georg Simmel, some other people that we'll get to in successive chapters. But let's take a look at the theoretical perspectives here. First one we've got is the functionalist perspective. Second one we've got is the conflict perspective. Third one we've got is the interactionist perspective. There is a fourth one, the feminist perspective, but it's fourth in the sense that there are a lot of researchers out there that do work specifically from a feminist perspective, but it can also be seen kind of as a sub-theory of conflict perspective simply because it focuses on one particular aspect of inequality, which would be gender inequality. But let's take a look at the functionalist perspective first. Now, structural functionalism, or functionalism as it's known, structural functionalism is the kind of fuller, older term for it, looks at how society is a structure, and it emphasizes the way parts of a society are structured to maintain its stability. We have this social structure, and within the social structure, we have social institutions such as family, education, politics, religion that provide function to society, and the purpose, of course, is to maintain social stability and social equilibrium. Some prominent functionalists would include Talcott Parsons, who gave us the idea of the sick role, the patient role, and the doctor role, and actually kind of wrote a seminal text on the social structure called The Social Structure. So looking at structural functionalism, and gave us this, one of the early contributors of this view of society is vast network of connected parts. And in the same way that each of the organs in your body perform a different task, but all of them are necessary for your body to remain healthy, all these different connected parts in society provide different functions, but each, by providing that function, helps to maintain the overall health of the system as a whole. We got this idea of functions, right? There are two different types of functions we can think about: manifest functions and latent functions. Manifest functions are those functions for which an institution kind of is organized. It's the open-stated conscious functions, intended and recognized consequences of an aspect of society. So if we look at, say, the social institution of education. Education as a social institution is really kind of responsible for imparting knowledge and skills, but also values, attitudes, and behaviors that are appropriate in society. It essentially is one of the social institutions that teaches people appropriate behaviors and how to be functional members of society. Some of the latent functions that education as a social institution provides would be things like social networking. How often do we maintain friendships or develop romantic relationships with people we meet in an educational setting? Or it can also be thought of providing daycare, because education, by providing a structured place for children, relieves parents of the obligation of caring for children in those particular hours while the children are interacting within the educational system. So those are latent functions, unconscious or unintended functions that may reflect kind of unintended or hidden purposes of an institution. And finally, we can think about dysfunction. Elements or processes of a society that may disrupt a social system or its stability. And dysfunction can grow out of something that provides function. What happens, of course, is when dysfunction gets too great, society reacts to bring itself back into a state of social stability, according to the functionalist perspective. An example of this might be, initially, when automobiles were first developed, there were no laws regulating their use on the roads, because initially automobiles were just a faster form of horse and carriage. But as roads began to be more defined, horseback kind of reduced, automobiles increased in prevalence, and especially I would say following World War II, when the industrial, as Dwight D. Eisenhower calls it, the industrial military complex sort of geared over to producing goods for private consumption, and the great industry that had developed for World War II switched over to private industry, providing kind of maybe necessities or luxuries for people. There began to be more and more cars on the roads. So a system of dysfunction developed in that when people were coming towards each other on a road, they didn't know which side to pass each other on. There was nothing kind of governing that in our society. And so there was this dysfunction created from something that had originally contributed function by enabling people to travel greater distance in shorter amount of time. All of a sudden, it started contributing by people getting injured and killed in automobile accidents. So, functionalist perspective. Structures, functions, social stability. Those are kind of the key concepts out of that particular perspective. Conflict perspective. Social behavior is best understood in terms of groups and individuals being in conflict or tension or competition, if you will, over access to resources. Resources including opportunities for education, employment, wealth, that kind of thing. So, competing groups competing over resources. Conflict is part of everyday life in all societies, according to Marx and the Marxist view. Conflict theorists tend to be more in favor of radical social restructuring than functionalist theorists. They tend to be more activist, more involved with social movements. As I said, a subset of the conflict view is the feminist perspective. Inequality in gender is central to social organization. The subordination of women is a central facet of social organization. This is kind of the feminist perspective. For years, essentially, when we think about women, we discount their experiences as valid. The feminist approach to doing research says that we need to understand that the experiences of women are every bit as valid, as worthy of social investigation as the experiences of men, and that we have to get away from the state of male as the assumed gender norm from which female deviates. I mean, if we think about a social theorist who did most of his work, he did work primarily in the field of psychology, but actually did some work in the field of sociology. That would be Sigmund Freud, who wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, which is really about the social world more than anything else. But Freud viewed one of the central personality problems women suffer from as penis envy, as not having a penis. So he was essentially saying that women suffer from the problem of not being men and wanting to be men. But if we think about this idea that it may not be about penis, maybe we can think about that more as a metaphor instead of an actual factual thing, and we can think more about power in society. Women have not had social power in the same way that men have. And so what Freud looked at and identified as a sexual component may actually be more of a social component. So the feminists view allies with the conflict perspective simply because it's about inequality. Proponents tend to focus on the macro level, again, looking at restructuring all of society and looking at the structure of all of society. And it broadened the social behavior analysis. It broadened research on social behavior kind of by extending the analysis beyond that male point of view, as I discussed. It was by treating the female point of view as valid for social research. The final one we have is the interactionist perspective. And while functionalism and conflict are both kind of big picture, macro level looks that focus on all of society, the interactionist perspective focuses at the micro level. It generalizes about everyday forms of social interaction to explain society as a whole. Humans move through a world of objects that have meaning. And it's the meaning that gets attached to objects and to symbols. So when we think about language is a set of symbols that we use to communicate. We are essentially exchanging the meanings attached to symbols in order to communicate with each other. And so we can think about this as a verbal component and a nonverbal component, okay? Why do people use emoticons when they're texting? Because the nonverbal component of communication can be as high as 35 or 40% of what's being communicated. Gestures, facial expressions, postures. We can even think about tone and intonation when we talk about like verbal communication. The way that we intonate when we say something can make it very different too, whether we're kind of saying it in a comedic fashion or a very deadly serious fashion, can change the meaning of it. And so the reason we need emoticons for instant messengers is the facial expression content and that intonation content is missing. Have you ever had a text message misinterpreted? You thought, I was just kidding, and wow, did they take it seriously, and I can't understand why they got so bent out of shape. Now we can just send the little winking emoticon to let them know that we're kidding, right? An interactionist interpretation of that is because we have symbols from facial expressions as well. We use facial expressions as symbols that communicate meanings. One of the key figures in the symbolic interactionist perspective was George Herbert Mead, who was at the University of Chicago. Gave us the idea of the self. He developed extended on what Charles Horton Cooley had done with the looking glass self and saw the self as the development of a social process. And Mead is regarded as the founder of the interactionist perspective. Another interactionist perspective theoretician would be Erving Goffman. Erving Goffman gave us the dramaturgical approach to the study of social behavior. Essentially, Goffman kind of took the immortal bard at his word in the play As You Like It. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. Each of them have their entrances and exits, each playing their part. Goffman said we can analyze social interaction as if people are acting. They're selecting amongst behaviors to present a favorable impression. So, social behavior can be analyzed as if it's a theatrical performance. The sociological approach. When we're doing research, we shouldn't be thinking about theory as an either or. Really, the best research incorporates more than one theory and may incorporate elements of all three theories into it. So if we draw on all these major theoretical perspectives, we'll gain the broadest understanding of society. When we're focusing on individual interactions, when we're looking at why people may do certain things in a group setting, maybe we're using more of an interactionist approach. But if we're focusing on like all of society and we're looking at how society has institutionalized racism, well, that's going to be more of a conflict perspective approach, you know, doing that kind of research. But if we're looking at the effect that institutionalized racism has on individual attempts to find a job amongst minority groups, well, then we've got a combination of interactionist and conflict perspective going on there. And if we bring into how is this creating social dysfunction, beginning to look at how it's harming society overall, well, then we're bringing our functionalist perspective into it. So each perspective is offering these unique insights into kind of the same situation or same issue. So when we talk about looking at racism, as we see, there are all different ways we can look at it. We can look at the effect it has on individual lives. We can look at the effect on, opportunities offered to people, and we can look at the effect on denying society the benefit of full participation by everybody. But researchers will have tendencies to be focused more in one area or another. Like, I would probably have to say that I'm a conflict theorist more than anything else. When I think about society, what stands out most to me is the inequality, and when I look at competition between people over access to resources, when I interpret outcomes from political elections and stuff like that, I tend to use a conflict perspective lens more than anything else. Okay, so let's take a look at some fields in sociology, what we would call applied sociology and clinical sociology. Okay? We're going to examine two fields there. We're going to learn to develop the sociological imagination. Applied sociology is when we actually take research and try to affect social policy or begin a social movement on the basis of theory and research. So we're using sociology to try and influence policy and better society, create better outcomes for people in society. Clinical sociology is when we're kind of using sociology to facilitate change by altering social relationships or restructuring social institutions. You can see there's overlap between these two concepts. But founding Hull House would be kind of an example of applied sociology. Human services and social workers would be kind of more of a clinical sociological approach. Basic sociology itself is just seeking profound knowledge of fundamental aspects of social phenomena. So when we think about developing a sociological imagination, one of the first things you want to do is maybe just start thinking about a particular question. What are you doing in college? Why are you in college? And not, if you say, well, I want to get a job. Well, what does that say about college then, that you're in college just to get a job? Is college a means of getting a job? Is that the role that college plays in society? Is it about just gaining knowledge? Well, if it was about just gaining knowledge, like Goodwill Hunting says, or Will Hunting says in the movie Goodwill Hunting, a library card enables you to gather knowledge. If it's about credential, then we're back to that kind of job thing, right? So, when we think about developing a sociological imagination, think about theory and practice. Research today, these are some of the things we'll be taking a look at in succeeding chapters, and you'll have in chapters. You will see areas in each chapter of the textbook where they talk about theory and practice, and they give you a question to think about, like maybe something like when we talk about a certain aspect of our culture think about this on your campus. How does this play out on your campus? We'll be looking at areas where people are doing research, current research in various social areas. And then finally, another way that the chapters will try to help you develop that sociological imagination is this idea of thinking globally. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness of culture, politics, economies throughout the world. It's the worldwide integration of government policies, culture, social movements, financial markets through trade and the exchange of ideas. And there are a number of processes that contribute to this: cultural diffusion, institutional isomorphism, a number of phenomena that contribute to the iron law of oligarchy, that contribute to globalization. And these are some of the concepts we'll be discussing in successive chapters in sociology, in this textbook, Sociology. So these are the things that you will see in these succeeding chapters to help you develop your sociological imagination. Theory and practice, where it will look at a particular situation. Research today and thinking globally. Okay, the significance of social inequality. If we think about that, social inequality is simply the condition in society in which people have different levels of stuff. Members of society have different amounts of wealth, prestige, or power. So, when we think about social inequality, a functionalist perspective on social inequality actually views it as beneficial because it provides the individual motivation to act, especially in a capitalist society. Personal gain. But when we think about the significance of social inequality, this will be another area of focus in the chapter, as will speaking across race, gender, and religious boundaries, and we'll examine social policy throughout the world. Okay. Careers in sociology. The number of students graduating with degrees in sociology has risen steadily. There are a number of careers in sociology that a degree in sociology prepares you for. One of those areas is actually working within human resources. Having a degree in sociology is considered one of the degrees that might benefit you in a career in human resources. Additionally, working for places like Gallup and Zogby, the polling places. A degree in sociology shows a demonstrated mastery of the methods being used in those polling places, because those polling places are using methods that are widely used and were somewhat developed in the field of sociology for gathering data as research methods. But it provides a strong liberal arts background for entry-level positions. People go on from sociology to pursue other degrees as well. Degrees in education, degrees in law. Sociology is a good degree if you want to go practice social justice, become a lawyer for an advocacy. Having a bachelor's degree in sociology is a good stepping stone for that. But additionally, sociology provides a foundation for an MBA, for working in social services, community organizations, community planners, things like that. Law enforcement even. Working within criminology, sociology is the foundation of criminology. Social explanations of deviance are the most widely used in criminology because social explanations of deviance offer greater explanatory power. Social theories on deviance offer greater explanatory power than either biological or psychological theories of deviant behavior. Government, career and politics. Okay, so that concludes this first lecture. We will be holding our next lecture a week from today, at roughly the same time, and then following that, we will be switching to a Monday lecturing spot. My name is Matthew Howell. My email address is mhowell1@ivytech.edu. I'm at the Valparaiso campus of Ivy Tech. Please feel free to contact me through email if you have any questions. And I will look forward to seeing people at this next